the research is showing with force plate data, outputs look the same. Impulse looks completely different, concentric impulse. P1 versus P2, the output is still the same, but the strategy is completely different.
Jess Ellis, welcome to VALDCAST, man.
Yes, thank you.
Selfishly, I'm incredibly excited. This is, I feel like, a long time coming, in my opinion. You've been an awesome mentor of mine for the better part of a couple of years, and it's cool to obviously communicate off camera and those sorts of things, but having a conversation like this is something I've been looking forward to.
Appreciate it, man. It was good to see you when we first connected, and I was like, this dude's gonna go far. Just from your perspective of PT, even like when you got out of school, it was like, and now you're at Vald, you're doing your thing, so it's amazing.
I appreciate it, man. It's cool. There's probably a rare few on the listening to the podcast that aren't familiar with the name or aren't familiar with Rehab Code or something along those lines. But in case there are people that Jess Ellis is a new name for them, you want to give people just a brief background on who you are, what you do, and where you're at?
Yeah, so I've been in the profession of PT for 16, 17 years. But I'd say in the last decade, it's been, I was at Exos, I was with the Portland Trailblazers, and then New York Knicks in leadership roles within those departments. And now I've just been putting a lot more effort in education with my company, Rehab Code.
Awesome, man. What about Rehab Code is, what do you guys do?
So I do weekend courses. I really try to refine the understanding of pathology and pathomechanics and how we need to kind of look at the rules differently, because I see the pendulum swing so much on the other end of outputs and kinetics. And I think we need to kind of pull back on the understanding of how people will modify movement to complete a task. So I teach a shoulder neck course. It's called the Schneck. And then I teach a knee course, but it dives into the concepts of pathomechanics and from manual therapy all the way to return to play decision-making. And then I also do a lot of mentorship. So even with this conference today, I can point out a good group of people that have kind of gotten into our programs, and it's been good to see the development of everybody.
I feel like over the last 6 or so months, pathomechanics has I've seen a bit of an uptick, and it's even just the word surfacing out a little bit more for people who are, or maybe it's new to them or they've heard it and they're like, but I don't have a good definition in my own head. How are you defining pathomechanics?
I mean, it's in essence within the word. Like biomechanics is basically what we look at from a natural movement sequence, and then understanding that when pathology or structures change, either for the short term or some situations they don't really change, those movement sequences probably will have to be modified. And there just needs to be more acknowledgement of that, because understanding that constraints are both joint related and nervous system. And if the geometry changes in some way, i.e. like the patella, which I'll be talking a little bit later about, there's a mechanistic effect of the geometry of that sesamoid bone that will alter the way that the body moves. But once it changes the structure, the nervous system has to then find different arcs of movement or different degrees of freedom to basically find a way to offload it.
We're going to take a bit of a change with the format of today's podcast. I'm a big fan of a lot of the things that you'll talk about and how you educate, because a lot of times it's, for lack of a better term, a series of different hot takes, in my opinion. And a lot of them are very, very sound and very structurally rooted in, basic science, applied science, research, and a whole host of different things. So what I've curated is a list of some of your best, in my opinion, hot takes, and I just want to get a little bit more context on them.
Sure.
I'm going to go off order just because you kind of talked about it with the knee, but you talk about wares of necessity.
Yes.
Tell me more about it.
I mean, I use that term from a few papers I read on the shoulder, and they would call it the tears of necessity, which was basically if you're going to require an overhead athlete to throw 95 miles an hour, it's going to have to create some structural change to accomplish that task. And if you throw 10 individuals that have a long pitching history, they're going to have labral pathology. So that goes into the tears of necessity. I just pivoted on that phrase for the knee, which is the wears of necessity, which is more specific to cartilage and how, especially with basketball, where it's predominantly deceleration load and chronic loads of plyometric, that structure will change. I've looked at enough MRIs within 7 seasons in the NBA. I got the benefit because I saw the structure. I got to see serial imaging of the knee, and then I got to see what the function looked like. And they were able to continue to play a full season with actual pathology that you would almost be concerned that they either have arthritis or are leading down that route. But they were, again, finding ways to play through modified kinematics.
Horizontal hop tests don't deserve a spot in your ACL return to sport testing. The single leg, triple, and crossover hop tests have become a staple in ACLR return to sport testing. They're easy to perform in the clinic and demonstrate good reliability, but this doesn't really matter if you're only testing the athlete's ability to compensate.
Yeah, I mean, that's a loaded comment, and hopefully we don't take too extreme view on that. Is there hopping? Is there value in hopping? Yes, there is. I do think that frequency of a test, especially in that way where there's a lot of transitional movement through multi-joint, I'm going to probably reduce that amount of frequency, because once you test it, you'll be able to kind of get an understanding. The problem is we bastardize the test. We put a tape measure on the ground and we look at the tape measure the whole time. We don't honor how the movement looks. The research is showing with force plate data, outputs look the same. Impulse looks completely different, concentric impulse. P1 versus P2, the output is still the same, but the strategy is completely different. So it is just, I think it could be fool's gold, or they might have very similar measurements, but I don't think we refine it enough. I don't think that we also standardize the test very well. Also, when we do the horizontal piece, that's more of a hip and ankle dominant movement, with the decel being a little bit more knee. So there's just ways for the body to figure out how to accomplish the task. And I think doing some more basic tests are probably more important. Even an altitude landing or a drop jump. I appreciate that a bit more because the entry of speed is the same, or hopefully is. So there is no more subconscious changing. You just have to respond to the stimulus. So that's, I do like to generally look at the responsiveness of both the drop jump and altitude landing based on different variations.
That's great. Yeah, and it's nice. I mean, being able to understand drop heights and being able to like actually measure that is, I don't know, like you're allowing that individual to understand, okay, as we successively increase in drop heights, whether it's through drop jump profile or just from an altitude drop, you can also, going back to, you'll see kinetics on things like force stacks or whatever it is, but you'll also see strategy changes, right? You'll see people as they go down, they'll start to lower their center of mass before they actually drop. And that's where you can start to cue people in on saying, hey, we're either getting into the territory where you're now uncomfortable with, and you can see that strategy change, or you can just say, hey, just try and stay tall and see if they're actually able to maintain that posture throughout.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be pragmatists in this. If we only have a little bit of time with our athletes and we want to screen how well they can function, I'm not going to do a test that they can sneak by and kind of make look normal. I'm going to do the things, a single leg decline squat, where I know it's high force peak and high impulse demand. I'm going to have them do a drop jump to see how it looks. And if they can't pass that test, then I'll pull it back. Now, clearly, if somebody's symptomatic, we have to appreciate irritability and severity, because then I wouldn't do that.
For sure.
Yeah.
All right. Figuring from our previous conversations, we have to have a little bit of philosophy sprinkled in here somewhere.
Of course.
So, Nietzsche said that people often write their own life stories and call it a universal truth. Sound familiar? "Quote unquote revolutionary rehab systems fall into the same trap. Someone gets a few great outcomes, packages their methods, and sells them as gospel. Nietzsche would tell you that if we really care about our craft, we cannot be consumers of branded shortcuts. Rehab that gets results isn't a system, it's a clinician that's willing to think."
That's just human nature. Our job is to minimize as much cognitive load in a day. And what does that do? That creates heuristics, and that creates, efficiency within our thinking. Now, when you start out early, that's an issue because you haven't earned the right to rely on your heuristics, which means you need to have stopgap assessment to reflect to see if you're correct. So a lot of these education companies will kind of create this promise of stay within this box and you'll get all the results you need. And then it just becomes an echo chamber where people stay within that group, and it builds them up and kind of builds their confidence. And I call it the mental cage. So the mental cage is the bird is stuck in the cage. The moment you open the door, the bird will actually choose to stay there because it feels more comfortable in that space than actually go out in the wild and be free. So I feel like these education companies stress that. They don't like to talk about context. They don't like to talk about it depends. And I think the major thing is the person will hold on to their thinking and their heuristics long enough because subconsciously they know that there's a sunken cost fallacy, which means I've believed in this for 10 years. I don't want to be wrong. Because then I have to admit to myself that I've been doing it wrong for 10 years and nobody wants to answer that. So I think that's a huge issue when we start to think about challenging the way that we approach care.
What's a way for people to essentially periodize the way that they're learning so that that doesn't happen?
Mentorship. I think finding the experts, subject matter experts to tap into if you don't have access to them, you need to read their material. You need to find people that think outside in more of the context and kind of explain it through principle-based thinking. I think that everyone should carve out topics or things that they're interested in and really put a lot of focus on that and put a time allotment to then get really good and then kind of refine it after they've kind of done a self-study for a bit. Those are good strategies. I think really looking for quality information is the big thing. There's so much out there and declarative knowledge is going to be rampant. Everyone's going to be able to look at AI and become an expert within a month. And the problem is the procedural knowledge that you don't gain unless you do it. So that's the other piece, is finding the right people to kind of guide you until you feel like you're comfortable enough to approach it on your own.
I'm curious, so kind of want to go a bit off script here. When you bring up AI, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, again, going down the declarative and procedural knowledge, right? I fully agree. Anybody can now become an immediate expert in all things rehab in a matter of months or weeks. When it comes to now clinicians in the field, where do you see benefits to that? Whether it's decision making or anything like that, and what other pitfalls besides just missing out on reps or things like that are you seeing?
The benefits is just the efficiency of getting legitimate information. I think we, as a group professionally, there's not enough consensus on how we approach certain diagnoses. We got to get better at that. We got to start to agree on how we train, how we get people stronger within certain phases. So I do think that's going to get better. It's going to help guide us in a more of a framework mindset. The bad thing is competition. So AI is going to take everyone's job at some point. How long it will take ours, I'm not sure, but what it will do within the next 2 years, it's going to bleed out the lines of our profession. So now I can tap into being more of a strength coach or a different profession, and a strength coach can look at what does the rehab process looks like. I can take it, and it's just, not only is it going to be competitive and within our own profession, but the interdisciplinary borders are going to be completely blended.
Moving on to another hot take of yours.
I didn't want to make it sound depressing. I'm just a realist on this whole subject. So
no, I fully agree too. I mean, I think you're already seeing that, right? Like you're already seeing, and the opinion that I've had a lot of times is professions in this industry, people kind of want what they can't have, right? If you're classically trained as a physio or as a PT, you'll look at the performance side of things and be like, oh, I don't always do that, so that's going to look enticing. Similarly, if you're in the weight room training athletes day in and day out, you'll look at rehab and be like, oh, why? Like, I know things from a squat, bench, deadlift perspective. Why are they doing like a single leg step down that looks highly underloaded? Like, let's try and figure out why that's happening. And so then you'll see people blend into that space as well.
Do you know why?
Do I know why?
Yeah.
I mean, my opinion is that they see that as something that's interesting, and then they want to be able to provide it. I think a lot of times people within the rehab industry as a whole and the performance industry have confidence in themselves to be able to essentially to say, oh, that looks doable. Let me go and test that out. But that's my personal take. I'd be curious to see what you have.
I think there's a when somebody gets to a craft or mastery, they get to a split in the road and they can go, I can go right, and this path looks a little bit more tailored. It's going to be easier. It looks like it's a little bit more of a descent. It seems like a lot of people are going that way. Oh, or I could go left and I actually got to go uphill. It doesn't look like much of a path. It looks like it's hard, but I might get up to the top and I might get a better view. That's mastery. When we get comfortable, we become complacent, and instead we go right and say, we're good with this part of my profession, and now I'm going to go fill my bucket with everything else. And I think it's a way to strategize on not seeing your full potential within your role that you went to school for. I think it's a way to guard that reality.
How do you see the influence then of rehab roles now changing? I think because I think rehab is continuously updating, right? And I think if you walked into a clinic 20 years ago, you would see people doing very different things to what hopefully you would see today. Again, being here at VALDCon, you'd hopefully see some type of technology integrated. You'd see some sort of objective testing. A lot of times people may look at that and then say, oh, that looks more like a strength coach than it looks like a physical therapist. However, a lot of times people are now looking at that as like, no, that just looks like good PT.
Yeah, it is the evolution of us. We have tools now that we can use, and S&C can use it, and so can we, because we need to have that as our guiding compass anyway. So technology is the compass of rehab. So that's what I'm going to see. I'm going to see there's going to be more supervision-based rehab, where it's virtual-based. They'll have equipment, or they'll have some type of device or something where you can track. Insurance companies continue to bring us down, so I think that's going to be a strategy. And then people are going to be able to put in, what do I do for my patellar tendinopathy? It hurts, and they just start doing it on their own.
Great segue. We've got a difference between cartilage and tendon here, and this is one of my personal favorite takes of yours, but loading principles aren't interchangeable. With different tissues come different rules. Cartilage is aneural, where pain experience actually comes from the subchondral bone, where tendons are the dumb and dumber of tissues. They need magnitude to allow for remodeling.
Yeah, I think you look at it because the issue now is the structure that is being remodeled is not able to do two things. not able to take on ground reaction forces from a compression aspect, and it doesn't do as well with the shearing, which is usually managed through fluid dynamics. So those two things from a mechanistic stance, it has a hard time doing, which means the knee is always kind of in this reoccurrency of a catabolic inflammatory event, which means those inflammatory agents kind of settle in. And then also the fluid starts to kind of interchangeably affect how that joint moves as well, both from a stimulation of your muscle and how it can activate, but even more the ability to glide through those interfaces of that joint. So that's, in itself a challenge. I think we have a hard time deciphering between that, or we just implement what tendon-based loading would look like, and it makes the knee worse. It's totally different. Tendon is more responsive. It wants more load. We need to get to Goldilocks of 6% strain to get that localized healing. Cartilage is much more, I almost look at it as if I would get somebody on an isokinetic unit and look at their torque curve, there's going to be a divot where it hurts. And I look at that divot to say, there's a strong percentage of it that is just neuromodulation. It is just pain. So I have to dig yourself out of that large divot to then truly see what is the current capability of force. And then once I've kind of improved that neural aspect, then we can start to say, okay, how much does this actually tolerate load and time under tension? Most of the time, athletes that have these cartilage lesions just find speed or change joint angles to get out of that area of pain.
For people maybe not without access to an isokinetic machine, right?
Yes.
Obviously, phenomenal machines, but not super accessible for the masses. Are there other indicators, tests, things like that you point to or look at as a key assessment strategy when you're, again, trying to find a localized deficit at a joint angle or something along those lines?
So if I'm looking at cartilage, if I'm looking at patellofemoral, I've talked about this before. I'm going to speak about it in 2 hours. The snowshoe versus stiletto analogy. Snowshoe is basically the broad distribution of force through the kneecap, and that's usually when you go into deeper amounts of knee flexion. You have 7 facets on that patella, and as it pushes into that trochlear cup, it kind of spreads out that force. 90 degrees is kind of the high point when it comes to absolute compressive force. So I look at the Spanish squat, the proper Spanish squat with the proper inclination angle of the trunk, not flexed. So I think that's a really cheap, easy assessment to see how do they tolerate with that pressure on the snowshoe. And then the stiletto, which is, it's that concentrated pinpoint on the heel. Well, that's more at 30 degrees. And that's because there's more load to the inferior pole. And it's also kind of that early engagement of the trochleus. So it sits more on that distal part of the sesamoid bone, and it doesn't like that. So a single leg decline squat is going to hit it. A split stance where the bad leg is back, you see it all the time. They don't like to hold that position. Why? It's in 30 to 40 degrees. The quad is in more of a stretch position that adds more compression to the kneecap. So that's a quick and easy thing I look at. And then the lateral lunge. And the lateral lunge, because if you look at the force coupling of glute max and quad when you do a forward lunge, it's a nice, the glute max is on a nice stretch. It's more aligned to be more sagittal in nature with all of its function. The moment you go lateral, the center of mass changes. The glute max can't help as much. Now glute med has to help, smaller muscle. So in essence, the lateral lunge is more dominant to the quad, and you can't shield force from the glute max. Also, there's likely going to be some kind of hip adduction moment, a drift, which then will lead to more lateral compression to the kneecap. And the odds are, if you're going to see somebody, it's usually trochlea on the lateral side and it's usually distal patella. So those are the quick, easy assessments. Lateral lunge, split stance with a reverse hold, and then a single leg decline squat, Spanish squat. It kind of gives me an assessment of tolerance there.
The ankle stiffens in basketball, and we need to stop worrying about it.
Oh, that's a new one. Yeah, I just think that, okay, we're going back to structure. I must be a structuralist, but it is the remodeling of that joint, especially in basketball. You have so many moments of plantar flexion. They jump from their ankles. There's just a tendency for that talocrural joint to want to go into plantar flexion. That's the repetitiveness. So what happens is you start to get stiff naturally in accessory movement with with basically dorsiflexion or posterior talar glide. Also, a lot of these guys have chronic ankle instability. So the body senses that as a concern because there's micro movements that happen. And with that, you can easily, the system goes, we need to improve the stability of this joint. And you see it all the time in other joints, which is they start to lay osteophytes, or they start to a tibial plafond. Basically, they extend the surface area to cover the talus. Well, that becomes a bony block. That's not a nice end field anymore. That is a stiff osseous end field. And I've done it enough and seen enough players that you're only going to get so much dorsiflexion out of these guys. You also need to look more at asymmetry. I put more weight on the asymmetry of dorsiflexion than the actual total amount that they have. As long as it looks symmetrical, it's basically telling me what's cooking in regards to that joint. And again, with all those plantar flexion, there's just tractioning that happens to the anterior synovium, and it just drives that response. And then with the flat foot, pes planus, it's very common with in the NFL and in basketball. But with that, you're going to have a rise in the first ray. And with that being raised, it's going to then limit the amount of excursion of the first MTP because it's jamming into that joint. So you're only going to have, a relative difference within that first toe extension. So I've seen people hurt athletes or create some kind of inflammatory state by mobilizing the first MTP and too much extension especially with closed kinetic chain. Same with the ankle.
We kind of opened this by talking about pathomechanics a bit.
Yep. Talk
to me more about what kind of pathomechanics may arise with the ankle and the foot when we're looking into these sort of, again, this the way I'm reading into this and the way you're kind of describing this is potentially one of those things of another pathology of permission, right? In a certain degree, right? Like you can only accelerate so hard, decelerate so hard and have so much force going through that talocrural joint before it starts to either increase its surface area or do something else to either disperse forces, prevent excessive motion, whatever those sorts of things are. Where do you see pathomechanics fitting in there?
I mean, we look at the loss of complexity. So you are born with this much degrees of freedom to a joint. And as refinement happens, now it narrows. So now you're only working within this amount of degrees of freedom. So isolation of force is much higher. So when you look at classic things, ankle sprains, chronic ankle instability, what happens is the person will avoid going into pronation, especially kind of mid stance. It's prematurely fires early stance. So when that happens, when they get through mid stance, they don't disperse through the midfoot as well, and they live in more supination, which means they're going to have a higher chance of re-spraining, which is the weird brain trick that our body does is, ow, I sprained my ankle, maybe I should avoid it. No, it actually leads to more of that. And usually it's a rate issue when it comes to the everters. They don't fire it like they need to. But knowing that if they don't supinate, it lives in more supination, you're going to put more load to the medial talus, which that's the highest, or that's the likelihood of you getting an OCD lesion of your talar dome. It's on the medial side. Also pes planus, so flat foot. I do see the calcaneus, which is the rudder of the foot. It likes to live in calcaneal eversion. And in my perspective, I think it unwinds the normal subtendon twists of the Achilles. We know that there's different variations of how much twist there is on people. Some people have a tighter twist. Some people have a loose, but there are variants to that. But if the rear foot falls into eversion, the change of vector of the medial gastroc, because it wraps to the lateral facet of the calcaneus. And if it lives in eversion, it's not wound like it needs to. So that's another element of Achilles tendinopathy, not being able to generate as much force. So those are kind of things I look at.
Amazing. Just I know we can go on and on about a bunch of different topics, but our goal with a lot of these podcasts is to try and keep them short and sharp.
Yeah.
With everything that you've got going on, a question I'd really enjoy just asking pretty much everybody is, what's next? What's coming up in the new year? What do you guys have planned for Rehab Code and for everything beyond?
Yeah, so I'm settled back in Phoenix. So I was in New York for a bit and moved back. So I have my space where I work with clients, work with athletes, and then also kind of build up my education framework. So again, weekend courses, get that rolling, and then mentorship. There's going to be more opportunities, not just myself. The reason why it's called Rehab Code is it's not just Elis LLC. I'm creating community and I'm wanting others to be involved. So that is my big goal for 2026 is just that growth of Rehab Code from a community stance.
Amazing. And if people wanted to get involved or reach out to you, how could they do that?
Hit me on IG, rehab_code.
Too easy, man.
It's easy.
I love it. Jess, really looking forward to hearing you talk later today. I'm sure it's going to be packed with a lot of great information for everybody in attendance. But thank you so much for coming on. This was an awesome conversation.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.